A little over 5 years ago, the United States experienced something that it hadn't seen since 1812. That thing was an armed storming of the Capitol. Armed protesters stormed through barricades. Law enforcement fought to keep control, and lawmakers were quickly evacuated. Some call it a protest, others call it an insurrection. But 5 years later, we still don't agree on what to call this. With an event this severe, it's pretty surprising that the two political parties of the United States disagree so heavily on what went down. Was it a protest with a few bad outliers that went violent? Or was it an armed insurrection with the goal of overthrowing the US government in a coup, incited by the sitting US president? Hey guys, I'm your host Dylan, and given it's been a little over 5 years, I thought what better a time to look at one of the biggest events in 21st century American politics, when at least some of the emotion has worn off from the event. I'm not here to trash anyone's politics, but to objectively look at what happened that day and see what it should really be called. I'll look at the research, the statistics, and the testimony while staying as unbiased as possible in order to answer the question at hand. First, we'll look at what led up to January 6th. Then we'll look at what actually happened on that day, how it's been defined and debated politically. Then lastly, what evidence says we should call it. But before we get into any of that fun stuff, you gotta look at the events preceding January 6th. Because in some important ways, this was not a new event to US history. To understand January 6th, you can't start there. You have to rewind to the weeks and months before. After the 2020 election, Donald Trump and his allies launched a wave of lawsuits across the United States, claiming widespread voter fraud. There were more than 60 cases in total that Trump and co. filed. Judges from both parties, including several directly appointed by Trump himself, reviewed the evidence. Not one found proof of large-scale fraud. Only a single case dealing with minor issues around how electors could vote came anything close to a sort of win for the Trump team, and it didn't change a single vote. In ruling after ruling, the message from the courts were clear. The election results were legitimate. But outside the courtroom, a very different story was taking place. The story of the stolen election. The narrative of the stolen or rigged election was gaining traction among Trump supporters. In the reemergence of the famous phrase, "Stop the steal." I say reemergence as the slogan was already used in the 2016 election by Trump and the 2018 Florida election, meant to show how there is major voter fraud against Republicans in these races. And when you look at the trends, as you can see here on the screen, there's a huge increase in the usage of the term across Google, Facebook, and other sites. But calling an election rigged is not a new thing to American politics. Just 10 years after the Civil War, the 1876 election between Rutherford B. Hayes and Samuel Tilden almost broke the country apart again. The two were extremely close across basically the entire country, within hundreds of votes of each other in Florida, Louisiana, and South Carolina. In this election, 82% of the voting age population had voted, the highest percentage in American history, even until today. And with their votes, they voted on average around 3% more for the Democratic candidate Samuel Tilden. What made the situation so dire is that each party claimed that their candidate had won in the key states and that they won the entire election, while also claiming that the opposing party had done major voter fraud and voter intimidation. Basically, imagine a 2020 election where the votes between the states were actually close, and where 200 instances of voter fraud could actually make a difference. And without getting too deep in history, Congress created a commission of 8 Republicans and 7 Democrats. It was supposed to be 7 and 1 independent, but that independent ended up resigning to take a seat in the Senate and was replaced by a Republican. And these 15 people voted along party lines to give Hayes the election 8-7. And to dispel a myth here, the idea of a compromise afterwards, called the Compromise of 1877 has very little historical evidence of being true. So it's unlikely that there was a backroom deal for Hayes to win the election in turn for deconstruction to end. Other elections that were claimed as fraudulent and rigged was the 1960 election between JFK and Richard Nixon, with there being a very small difference in the votes in Illinois and Texas. And if there was a few thousand voter fraud incidents that could have changed the victor. And then there's the famous 2000 election where the votes were so close in Florida, and that a recount had already happened multiple times where the Supreme Court stepped in, voted on party lines, and give the state to George W. Bush. So contested elections weren't new, but something else was. None of these elections ended with an armed group of protesters going to the Capitol wanting to take the country back. In 2020, that's exactly what began to happen. There were paramilitary groups that, in their own words, coordinated for what was coming. These groups included the Oath Keepers, the Proud Boys, and the Three Percenters. People love to throw around the words far right and radical against anyone who they don't agree with, but if these groups are not included in far right radicals, the words are completely meaningless. Many of these members of these paramilitary groups were sentenced to lengthy prison sentences, usually around 20 years or so, being charged with seditious conspiracy. Along with this, if you watch any documentary about January 6th, you'll see that they brought physical weapons and chemical sprays with them to the Capitol, which isn't a good look if you're trying to claim that you were there just to protest peacefully. But other than weapons that a few groups had, even if the reasons for the event were misguided, and there actually wasn't voter fraud, if it's a protest, then who really cares? But that's the big question. Was January 6th a protest where a few went violent? Or was this a protest that people planned in order to overturn the results of the 2020 election? Well, it's a little complicated. The morning started like a traditional Trump rally. Patriotic music, flags waving, and a crowd that believed that they were listening to someone who was going to save the country. At around noon, Donald Trump had taken the stage. He repeated the claim that the election had been stolen and told the crowd, quote, "We will never concede," and urged them to march to the Capitol. Then came the line history will remember. If you don't fight like hell, you're not going to have a country anymore. That sentence was used by many for the reasons of the events that were about to take place. As he spoke, the joint session of Congress was underway, counting the Electoral College votes that would make Joe Biden the next president. Around 1 p.m., the barriers to the Capitol were breached. What began as chanting and yelling turned to shoving and fighting. Rioters clashed with Capitol Police, who were quickly overwhelmed as there was only a few dozen around the entire facility for tens of thousands of protesters. Some protesters carried flags and signs, what you would expect at a rally. Others brought batons, pepper spray, and body armor. By mid-afternoon, mobs were breaking windows and forcing their way inside of the Capitol, where they were not allowed. Inside the building, officers were literally crushed and squeezed in between doorways, sprayed with chemicals, and beaten with poles. Lawmakers were rushed out as rioters screamed at them to stop the steal. And while the chaos unfolded, the president watched from the White House dining room. According to witnesses, from roughly 2 p.m. to 4 p.m., Donald Trump had not made any calls to the Pentagon or National Guard, and no public statements urging these protesters to stop. At 4:17 p.m., he released a video from the Rose Garden. Here are his words. "I know your pain. I know you're hurt. We had an election that was stolen from us, but you have to go home now. We love you. You're very special." Obviously, you can see, even in this message that was meant to calm down the fervor, he made sure to include that the election was stolen. He resisted using stronger language to call off the riot, and specifically used the words, "leave now." The video was restricted about an hour later by every major social media platform, saying it contributed to, rather than diminishing, the risk of ongoing violence. Around 6 p.m. the National Guard arrived, and Trump left the Oval Office for his personal residence. He tweets again, referencing the sacred landslide election victory, stripped away from the Great Patriots. This video was also removed an hour later for similar reasons as the one prior. By the time order was restored, over 140 police officers were injured. 5 people were dead or dying, and the Capitol, a symbol of American democracy, while saying left in ruins might be strong wording, but it certainly was wrecked. In the days following, the country tried to make sense of what had happened that day. Was it a riot? A protest that spiraled out of control? Or an insurrection? These were big questions to answer. And sadly, the answer that you gave or were given was dependent on which political party you supported. Many legal scholars define it as an insurrection, saying it was a violent uprising against a lawful transfer of power. But other scholars argue that it wasn't coordinated enough. It should be seen as a riot, not a coup. The truth is, words matter. Initially, many Republican leaders condemned the attack. But as months passed and Trump's grasp on the party remained strong, rhetoric began to soften. Some began calling the rioters political prisoners. Others compared it to the BLM riots of 2020, saying that Democrats were hypocritical to condemn one form of unrest but not the other. Meanwhile, the House Select Committee launched a massive investigation into the events. Hours of testimony, hundreds of witnesses, tens of thousands of documents. Their findings painted a clear picture that multiple extremist groups planned violence, that the White House ignored obvious warnings, and that the president's inaction prolonged the chaos. But the committee's report didn't end the debate. It just made party lines deeper. And by 2024, polls showed that the country was split pretty much half and half. By 2024, the public was split 60-40, with the 60% seeing January 6th as a serious threat to democracy. The other 40% saw it as political overreach, or even justified protest. And into that divide, Donald Trump stepped back into power. When Trump was re-elected president in 2024, he went about pardoning or commuting virtually every single person that was sentenced due to their actions on January 6th. Leader of the Proud Boys with alleged messages showing he was willing to overthrow the government. He was pardoned. Leader of the Oath Keepers having a stockpile of weapons to use against the government if they needed it, according to messages. Pardoned. A video showing someone smashing a Capitol window with a stolen police riot shield. Sentence reduced. Potential less nefarious reason for these pardons is the fact that Trump didn't look at every case individually and just did a blanketed pardon for everyone. But you could make an argument that that's just bad government, not to look at every case. And so there's a decent chance that some people that committed legitimate crimes on January 6th got out scot-free due to the politics surrounding the situation. But importantly, Donald Trump had 4 years since the event, so how has he come around and explained January 6th? I did nothing wrong on January 6th. The attack was a peaceful and patriotic protest. Listen, I understand if you think I'm taking these quotes out of context, but any protest that threatens the safety of Congress is just not a peaceful and patriotic protest. My goal is to stay unbiased and neutral on this channel, but sometimes that means that what some people hold as political truths are just wrong. But just keep listening, because Donald Trump claimed that the attacks on police officers were very minor. No, the officers were pretty badly injured. You don't concede when there's theft involved. Maybe there's an argument for this, but time and time again, the courts, the arbiter of the entire voting system, found that there was no theft or stealing or rigging of the election. I have nothing to hide. I wasn't involved in that. If you look at my words and what I said in the speech, they were extremely calming, actually. Now, to be fair, anyone that's trying to claim that Trump incited violence through the speech, I don't think that's completely fair. But looking back on his speech, it's also not fair to call it a calming speech. Telling people to fight like hell to save your country is not calm. He then claimed that there were hundreds of FBI agents planned at the protest to agitate the protesters. Maybe this was the case. The Biden administration didn't find anything, but maybe they're hyper-partisan. But even in the current Trump DOJ, nothing has been overturned. Still, he's not wrong by saying that not everyone saw themselves that way. Many came to the protest peacefully and stayed that way or got swept up in the mob, that they just didn't have any control of what was going on with the situation. But still, the president's added numbers and momentum to something much darker, and representing an event like January 6th as a peaceful protest is just a lot. There's no way around it. If you think that's political, I'd argue that just calling a spade. And now that brings us to the next section. What does the evidence truly say we should call January 6th? Well, first, it began as a protest. A crowd drawn to Washington with the belief that democracy had failed them. A belief that was built on a lie, frankly. A lie repeated so often by people that they looked at as their political figures that millions believed it as true, even to this day. Fueled by that lie and inflamed by extremist groups, a portion of the crowd crossed the line from protest to violence. What they did wasn't just disorderly. It was an organized attempt, however chaotic, to stop the lawful transfer of power. What the extremist groups did there fits the definition of an insurrection pretty well. But it's also true, like I was saying earlier, and to a fact, most people did not see themselves as part of a grand insurrection plan. And so the main lesson of January 6th isn't just about who was guilty. It's about how easily misinformation can mobilize ordinary people into a mob that generates violence. And it's not a lesson confined to one side or spectrum. Left-wing protests that turned violent in 2020, like the BLM riots or the Capitol Hill occupied zone in Seattle, show how any movement can cross the line when outrage replaces reason. And actually, in the future, I'd like to do a look at the left-wing riots during this time, because those are also hyper-political. And while we're on that, if you found anything that I got really wrong about this video, leave it down in the comments below and I'll correct it in the pinned comment. But back to January 6th, the difference between January 6th and the left-wing riots was the scale of its target. It wasn't the police station or businesses or abstractions like racism. It was the Capitol and the abstraction of democracy and the republic as a whole that the US is built on. January 6th was a terrible event that started from a misguided idea. From a president that claimed election fraud and rigging, with very little evidence to support it. But it was peaceful. Then it wasn't, and hundreds got injured, many died. Trust was lost, and a significant portion of the population came away from January 6th with the idea that violence is necessary to save democracy, and that elections can't be trusted. So what's the truth of January 6th 5 years later? Well, you just heard it. It was a protest that was misguided, that turned violent. It gives us many lessons to learn, and one of them is that it's not just a right-wing issue, and that this can be found from anything on the political spectrum. This isn't the only contentious political event that's separated by party. About the recent uptick in political assassinations in the US, especially after the most recent assassination of Charlie Kirk. Many MAGA Republicans have come away believing that the left is to blame for violence. And you know what? They might not be totally wrong. You can check that video out right here. And don't forget to stay peaceful, don't push lies, and think controversy. I'll catch you over in this video right here.